Something like this, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Peter.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm very sorry that I'm not able to make it today. But thank you all for coming. I wanted to start by saying kind of the inspiration for this, which is that when we have been working on a range of different things, particularly around questions that brought us together, for instance, around things like renewable energy communities and the energy commons, one of the things that really struck us was that in many ways we were speaking very similar languages about trying to understand methodologically and at a deeper level, in many ways, epistemologically, about how and in what ways different social relations and dynamics and power interact to allow for certain types of social configurations and formations to emerge and for others to not emerge, and then for allowing for others to become more resilient and for challenges or alternatives potentially to be produced. So I think this is part of a broader conversation and now project that I've been excited to work on um, with Lorna, Marc, and Brahms on rethinking not just property and hegemony, but bringing together resilient property theory and ideology and discourse analysis. So this is kind of the background of this and the foundations, because I do think that these speak together in such a way that really can allow us to, at a fundamental level, think about a very important issue, which is property, which impacts almost everything. And then I think at a kind of deeper theoretical and conceptual level, think about, gives us new mechanisms or new ways to consider kind of ongoing questions of hegemony, power, and ordering. So let's see if I can change this or not. Oh, here we go. So can everyone still hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Right on the money. Or I say right on the comments. So I think one of the big questions that we're asking is how can we integrate resilient property theory with ideology and discourse analysis to reshape our understanding of property and power? And it's very exciting to do this at Essex because the University of Essex has a very, very long tradition, and I know that some of you have been part of it, of actually really being at the forefront of thinking about questions of the ways in which dominant discourses are fundamental at a constitutive level of shaping not only how we think, but also how we are regulated in terms of actions, but also in terms of the kind of practical configurations and orderings of the social. So I think, I've been fortunate enough, I know others have been fortunate enough, but this is really, it's interesting. I'm sure Marx and others were thinking, what better place than Colchester to fundamentally rethink power? But that was kind of where it was. So in this sense, this has been a very, very strong tradition at the University of Essex. And now, I think in part, because I don't want to say it's just at Essex, I'll let Lorna, Marc, and Brahms fight that out amongst themselves. But certainly we'll say Tulsa, Maastricht, and Essex, that there's an emerging new theory within the legal discipline around resilient property theory, which we'll get to. And what's exciting about this is that kind of they're speaking in many ways about some of the same exact dynamics. And they allow us in their kind of productive engagement with each other to, I think, fill certain gaps that they might have with, but also complement each other in terms of expanding and extending what I think this ongoing project has been, which is how do we understand the regulative but ultimately contingent way in which power operates in terms of social ordering. So for context, and this is one thing we're going to be looking at, and I think, and we'll speak about it, why property is such a fantastic way to go about this. And it's not just because when I was doing my PhD, I think every other phrase, and maybe David, who I think is attending, can say this, was, when are we going to talk about class war? But was the kind of, traditional liberal frameworks of property and how this represents a particular type of dominant hegemonic discourse, but also the emergence of counter-hegemonic possibilities. And this allows us to think about, and I think resilient property theory is fantastic with this, to reimagine property as a dynamic, socially embedded site of both resilience and resistance. And why that I think is so critical is it also begins to allow us to think about hegemony and counter-hegemony, I think beyond its own particular liberal frameworks, which I've written about before, which are often found in terms of dominance and resistance, to different modalities of resilience and sustainability. And what this allows then is to understand about how does counter-hegemony feed into, incorporate, and allow for points of not just resisting a dominant order, but creating more resistant alternatives? And how does this also maybe break down some of the ways in which we might have some enlightenment-based views of dominance and change as this kind of dominant order, such as something like the state, that has to be just, resisted against? So just to give a sense of the theoretical foundations, and we'll be going into this more in depth, obviously. So these do come from very different traditions, and I think it speaks volumes that um, that there has been such a dovetailing, because I think it shows the importance of the ways in which you're speaking to very important issues. Um, so resilient property theory. Oh wow. Okay. Is everything all right?
Yeah, that was my fault.
Um, we don't blame, comrade. We just think that. Um, so resilient property, and I feel very bad being the one to this is gonna begin because it's like I'm the least person here to introduce it, but I will do that very briefly here. Is views property as a dynamic, material, and relational. And very critically, it focuses on the resilience of institutions and stakeholders. And I think these 2 points become very important and very significant in the sense that if we take each of their parts here, that it's dynamic, meaning that it's evolving, it's not static, it can't be reified in terms of easy fetishized beliefs or discourses, but it's also material in that it's taking on a whole range of different materialities, whether that's natural resources, whether that's artificial material that's being used for buildings, etc. And it's relational, meaning that it's engaged in a whole range of social, economic, and political configurations and reconfigurations. And what I think is interesting is that it focuses here then on the different degrees and intensities and availabilities of allowing certain types of institutions and certain types of stakeholders engagements to be more or less resilient. And I think this idea of resiliency becomes very interesting again, or at least I think it's interesting, as most, I'm not a very interesting person. So what I find exciting might not be exciting to everyone else, but I certainly find it exciting because I think resilience traditionally has, or at least within the last 30 years, has somewhat been framed as how can we be more resilient neoliberal subjects potentially. But what this actually allows for us to show that when we think about resilience, I think at a kind of more epistemic level, what this speaks about is what are the ways in which contingent sets of institutional arrangements and subject positions are made more or less embedded and socially sedimented? And how can this be continually mobilized and activated? And what are ways in which you can make other sorts of arrangements more or less resilient? So for me, this speaks obviously, and I don't know if this is that I see every nail with the same hammer or every whatever that phrase is, but as kind of building on or at least being able to speak to an ideology and discourse analysis perspective. So I think for many people here, this will be quite familiar, so I apologize. And again, just as I was unable to do full justice to resilient property theory in 2 PowerPoints, um, it's difficult to do full justice to, the Essex School of Discourse in 2 PowerPoints, bullet points, but I will do my best. What we can see here is that discourses shape power and identity. I think this is important that we're not talking about arbitrary shaping. We're not talking about a complete full move away from ideas of structural regulation. But we are talking about the fact that we have regulative discourses that in very contingent and dynamic, and I would say material and relational ways, shape dominant sets of relations that help to embed particular types of practices and power dynamics. And what this allows us to begin to see is that hegemony is both something that is coherent and strong, but it's also something that is fluid, contingent, and contestable. And it shifts hegemony from something that in many ways is a kind of almost tactical or strategic aspect of the material relations of history into something that's constitutive of it. So hegemony is not merely a reflection of some real reality, but actually fundamental to the constitution of the social reality. So this allows for a synthesis of bridging material and discursive dimensions to explore property law as a site of power, and also then using that as a thing to rethink how we think about questions of hegemony, counter-hegemony, and democratic transitions. So when I was kind of, reading through these things, I mean, I can't think of anything for me that's more exciting. And again, maybe I just need to renew my Netflix account, but then, really getting into the depth of how do we think about power in terms of resiliency, and how do we think about hegemony and counter-hegemony through the lens of this kind of question of, at a very, very deep level, resiliency and non-resiliency as part of embedded institutional and subject relations. So that's kind of the beginning context for this. I hope I did it justice. If not, you can just throw things at me from behind, or you can completely contradict what I've said now in this next part, where we actually start going into the more depth and richness of resilient property theory, which I think is a really important intervention, not just within the legal discipline, but I think more generally.
All right, thanks, Peter. That's me. Hi, everyone. My name is Bram. Next to me is Marc. You know Lorna, I assume, just to clarify which one is Bram and which one is Marc. I thought it was Marc is the nice addressed one always. That's the. So to dive a little bit into what Peter was saying, we thought it might be helpful to explain just a little bit more about the legal side of research and how property, and in particular property law, has been perceived and studied, throughout, let's say, the last century. I must say the overview I'm about to talk about, I have borrowed from Eva van Meulen, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam. But I promised that wherever I would use it, I would mention her name. So here I've done that, but we've made it quite our own in what I want to say. And so what legal scholarship has been doing traditionally is what we call classical or doctrinal legal research. And that means that legal scholarship has been looking at the concrete rules of property law. And so to take, for example, land ownership or the ownership of a house, and we've just looked at, so how do I get this? And what does it mean if I have it? And if I have it, but Lorna buys my house, then how, so the transactional side, how does Lorna become the owner and I lose my right of ownership? So the derivative acquisition, as we call that. And that has been traditionally really until different than in other fields of law, until the 1980s, 1990s, maybe even the early 2000s, this was a nationally studied area of law. And so there was hardly anyone looking into this from a comparative point of view, let alone, maybe comparing Germany and France or something like that, but let alone doing a global comparison or looking at the US or looking at Africa, African countries, South American countries, etc. This is really not done. And so the first step away from that came in what we here describe as utilitarian or law economics analysis. And so what scholars, especially US scholars, started to do, indeed, the Chicago School of Law and Economics started to do, was to see if they could explain why property law looked like a certain way on the basis of, in particular, information cost analysis. And they would say, okay, so you have these property rights. How do you find out about them? You incur costs, but you get a lot of benefits. And they try to find, for example, what we call an optimal standardization level. So how many property rights can there be vis-a-vis how many costs would the market make in making them? And the objective of that is very utilitarian in the sense of welfare profit maximization. And the idea that every market actor is a rational choice, makes rational choices, and the only, a decision that I make is good for me, but also because it's good for me, it's also good for the rest of us. And that became an extremely influential school of thought that really found ground also and traction, not only in the US, but European scholars in particular started to take that over. And against that, a group of scholars then try to posit what they called progressive property theory. And this also mostly, again, started in the US, but many of us, three of us included, jumped on that wagon for a while. And we thought it's very interesting, but it was a counter movement against that utilitarian point of view. And so what happened is that property law went from, let's say, classic rule-based analysis, and maybe for everyone in this room, the somewhat more boring part of this, describing what we sometimes call technical rules or technicalities, into much more looking into the philosophical underpinnings of property, but then the legal theory, not so much the philosophy itself, but rather the legal philosophy and the legal theory that underlies this, and whether this be utilitarianism, or as many progressive property lawyers started to do, they started moving into personhood and ideas of personhood, and in particular into Aristotelian virtue ethics and human flourishing as a different way of looking at the system of property law. But what all of these three systems share is that they look at property law as if the only thing existing are private parties and private actors. They don't see or consider, most of them, that the state may be involved in some points, and the fact that you have a property right is that you have a right that's actually sanctioned by the state. That's really not something that was part of the scholarship, and it became, of course, deeply rooted, without diving very much into the hardcore philosophy of it, but it became deeply rooted in a metaphysical analysis of property. And against all that, there's more of us, but we try to posit a fourth way here, and that's really where the resilient property theory that Peter described comes in, where we don't take a very abstract starting point or a very metaphysical starting point, but we really take a problem analysis, and we describe and try to find a problem sphere, and then accept through in a way stakeholder mapping exercise that more than only private parties can be involved, and whether those be corporations or whether those be the state, we all should take into account the role that they play, the way in which the role that they play in addressing property problems. But at the same time, also we try to place property law not in isolation, as if it's one single system that behaves outside the realm of anything, because that's very much what the classical property law analysis is about. To be the most extremist example of that is always the libertarian view, where we talk about property rights being pre-political and the state having nothing to do with them. They exist outside the realm of anything. And we try to connect that back also to bigger questions of what does it mean to be an owner in whatever situation, and why do property lawyers, that's one of the research questions we're working on, why do many property lawyers situate property law outside the realm of any of our liberal democratic system? Those are the questions that we're asking ourselves.
And just stay on the slide for another second.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the significant features of what Bram has described is that property discourse amongst lawyers, even when it seeks to be progressive or to pursue more progressive perspectives, and to think about the social and as well as the economic, it's always located within a liberal frame. And of course, property is a central institution of liberalism, but it's also located in the private realm. And inevitably, and in fact, we often say that paradox of neoliberalism is that at the same time that it rides on the crest of a wave around strong property rights, it also denies that what happens within property law is something that we are concerned with as a public, because it locates transactional property law within the private realm. And we didn't set out to challenge that actually in our research agenda, but we found that the sorts of property problems that we were investigating, we couldn't answer the questions that we had using the theories and the methods that were on the shelf within the Property Law Academy. And the root of what developed as resilient property theory was a book that Marc and I wrote together called Squatting in the State. And it was a response to an interest that we had as property scholars in homeless squatting in empty land. And that was really interesting as a problem, because over the last 20 years, there's been this wave of criminalization of squatting, which is really interesting, because historically, when we were in law school, squatting was seen as something that was a private conflict between the squatter and the owner. And once an act is criminalized, you tip it into the public sphere. And there's been this blurring of the line between private sphere and public sphere. And we were really curious about state responses to squatting as a practice in different jurisdictions over different periods of time, and the way in which those state responses shifted and changed. So that kind of directed us towards looking at the state and looking at how states respond to property problems in a way that takes you out of that private realm. So Bram mentioned that the feature of the liberal property theories, and again, well-meaning scholars who've taken on the label of progressive property. I think probably from outside of the US, we might not think that it's all that progressive in terms of the way in which it's locked within a liberal framework, and quite there is a real absence of challenging those ideas, even amongst people who are leading lights there. And what that means is, as Bram said, they say instead of rooting ourselves in utilitarianism, we root ourselves in Aristotelian or virtue ethics. But a common feature of these things is that they're still not looking at the state. And they're locating, one of the questions for us is that we often see property as the barrier to environmental protection, or we see property as the barrier to being able to address housing crisis. And we're kind of interested in where that power of the idea of property is sourced. And when we look at Western jurisprudence, in the history of Western jurisprudence, it's pretty much always sourced in some kind of metaphysical claim. So it goes back to the idea that God has vested this authority, and then the divine right of kings vested this authority. And it's always sort of relying on competing truth claims. So there's this kind of left versus right conflict around what property means, and looking away from the role of the state, both in making the laws, but also in the state's own stake in property problems. And that was the interesting thing about criminalizing squatting. It revealed the fact that states have a stake in the outcomes of property law in a way that wasn't clear before. So if you flick on to the next slide, Peter. So one of the questions that we've been trying to think through, and we would really welcome your help in this because it's new ground for us, is trying to understand what an alternative to metaphysical truth claims would be as a source of property's authority, and how we could rework the idea of property and its authority through the lens of democracy. And one of the books that we find really helpful with this is Johan van der Walt's book, The Concept of Liberal Democratic Law. Johan van der Walt is a jurisprudence professor at the University of Luxembourg, South African, and has written a lot about post-apartheid transformation within South African law. He wrote a brilliant book called Law and Sacrifice. And one of the themes of his work is recognizing that dividedness and conflict is an inherent part of our communities. And this is really important because the metaphysical truth claim source for property imagines that we're a single legal community. And you know, the claim is either we're a single legal community and everybody agrees that utilitarianism is the right way to organize, or we're a single legal community and everybody believes that Aristotelian ethics is the right thing to do. So that they have these competing claims, but always there's this assertion that of a kind of coming together of a community to subscribe to. We can't agree on what that is, but there's this kind of idea that you can bridge the gap, you can bridge the dividedness of life. And Johan van der Walt traces in this book through all of the history of Western jurisprudence from the Romans, in kind of through the lens of irresolvable differences of opinion. So it's not to say that there aren't people who are pluralists in terms of ethics, but they're always asserting an orthodoxy on as the single truth claim. And there's no bridge and the challenge Johan van der Walt flags is that doesn't reflect reality, that any appeal to a legal community that shares commitments is false, because
Interesting.
he says we assume a concept of fusion between law and life. We assume the possibility of a single grand theory, and the question is just which grand theory is going to win. And we're kind of interested in building on what Johan van der Walt has said and trying to find an alternative source for law's authority through democratic processes, in a way that recognizes that there's always a winner and a loser. But he says what we must avoid is having permanent winners and forgotten losers. So it's inherent in law and in property law that a case has an outcome and somebody gets the outcome they wanted and somebody else doesn't get the outcome that they wanted, or that when you design the law that that you have to produce compromises, that it's not about competing orthodoxies. It's about how do we reconcile the fact that we have different views, and without it being a kind of a winner or a loser outcome. You go on to the next one, Peter. Another area of work that we've drawn a lot on is Andre van der Walt, no relation, but a brilliant South African property scholar who did a lot of work in reimagining post-apartheid property law. And one of his wonderful papers is this article, The Modest Systemic Status of Property Rights. And he highlights the way in which within law, property has assumed a kind of status of exceptionality, that other areas of law can flex and change with legislation, or the state can choose to sort of reshape an area of law. But property, because it makes its claims in natural law, positions itself before and above the state, as pre-political, and that has given it this status of exceptionality. And we're really trying to think about how do you undo that? How do we signal the undemocratic nature of an area of law that positions itself before the state? And what Andre van der Walt brilliantly does in this article is by taking the South African Constitution as a single system of law, demonstrates how property is not immune from the requirements that Constitution sets out and from the ambition that it sets out to re-establish a system of law based on human dignity. And he says that we must stop imagining that property is the hero on the white steed coming in to rescue us all from tyranny. He said, I prefer to think of property as a gaggle of cleaners who come in to sweep up what's left after the real work of the democratic legal system has been done. And that's a way of talking about the systemic positionality of property law that doesn't put it before all of the other work that the democratic legal system needs to do in terms of life and dignity and equality and all of the other rights that are set out in constitutions. And then finally, the third piece of this, Peter, is we also, when we were developing our work, were engaging with Martha Feynman's vulnerability theory. And Feynman's vulnerability theory also rejects the idea of the liberal legal subject and all of the baggage that has brought us around individualism. And instead, she calls it reasoning from the body. It reasons from the idea that as flesh and blood humans who are embodied and who are embedded in structures, that we need to think about a framework of law that is geared around mitigating our vulnerability. And she especially centers the importance of institutions in that, in recognizing that the individual isn't able to mitigate that, and we shouldn't expect that individuals can mitigate those vulnerabilities, that we need to rely on institutions. And particularly, she argues for a responsive state, that whatever we think about a government, that really only the state is able to work at the institutional scale that's needed to be able to mitigate vulnerability. So if you go to the next one, Marc's going to say a little bit in a moment about the way in which we frame up our sources and a little bit more about the theory. But I think that there are three things that we talk about in resilient property theory that we see reflected in the conversations that we're having with Peter. And it is firstly and of course these things are all everywhere. We don't see them separately, but for the purposes of unpacking it, that the power of property ideologies and property as an idea. And one of the real challenges that we have is when we look at property rights and law and constitutions, very often they aren't as strong as the rhetoric around strong property ideologies would make you believe. So there's this interplay going on between like what's the actual jurisdictional reality of property's power versus how is that being overblown in a neoliberal property discourse. So we're interested in trying to unpack, what's doing the work here. Is it the law that's actually doing the work here, or is it the rhetorical ideological discourse that's doing the work? And then finally, there are often when we talk about property, we don't center enough the fact that property is three things. It's rhetoric and ideology, it's legal rights, but it's also an institution. And the institution of private property is one that has material importance and is located in how, as an institution, it serves the needs of the whole of the community. So we're trying to unpack at the moment whether this parallel holds that we're just coming to, that when people talk about property, and in fact, when people talk about property and democracy, they seem to mean different things, and sometimes we mean different things by democratic. So there is a progressive property scholar who writes about property as the law of democracy, but what he means by that is that our grand theories should produce more inclusive outcomes. So it's a sense of democracy in serving the whole of the community. And that's different from some of the ways in which we, especially with the work we've done in South Africa, understand the democratic process and the question of whether or not property is immune and above democratic processes. And then thirdly, in the conversations we're having with Peter around democratic practices, a lot of critical legal theory focuses on what happens outside of the state and what happens outside of the law, and the way in which counter-hegemony is asserted through those practices. But we're interested also in how you then bring that within the constitutional legal frame, and what the role of those democratic processes is in producing different outcomes.
Can I say one thing on practices real quick? One of the things that makes practices so important for us thinking through these processes, both, especially from the property side, is how powerful practices have been, but have been hidden underneath law. So one of the things that we often will say is that even when laws change, the practices that are built out of those laws remain. And they're oftentimes really hard to undo. And so they're, being able to confront and think about practices specifically in the context of a democratic tradition, I think is one of the things that makes this project so unique and exciting.
Okay, back to you, Peter.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I muted myself out of politeness, but I'm very bad at unmuting myself. Though my partner may disagree. So I think this then brings us to, I would say, a really theoretical impasse in terms of how we think about hegemony and property. And why I would say that this is an important intersection is because of the fact that property represents, I would say, within both often the legal discipline and its application, a quite strong hegemonic discourse. But it also has, I think, very, very foundational and constitutive impacts on broader forms of social ordering. So it tells us something, I think, really more fundamental and wide-ranging about hegemony if we can understand this in terms of its kind of a problem-setting methodology that was discussed earlier. So in this say, you can see that, property law definitely reinforces dominant ideologies such as hegemony. And goes back to the ways in which it can be kind of reified as this almost mystical idea of, what is the right of property and who has this right and under what conditions. And then what this then provides then is, if you will, the field of meaning upon which property is allowed to exist as not just a kind of social artifact that is fundamental to social relations, but again, as this almost reified mystical element, which really can't be questioned in any significant, substantial way. And yet, within that, as already discussed, we can see that there have been ongoing spaces for counter-hegemonic practices. And this occurs, I think, at three levels that are really quite important here. The first is obviously in terms of discourse. So, I think we can all speak to very strong antagonistic discourses of, uh, questioning private property from an ideological point of view. However, this is also seen in terms of, I would say, these kind of broader discourses of thinking about how property ideologically has a whole range of different social effects that doesn't easily fit within these types of frameworks. So I think about things like public housing, for instance, or even just thinking about from an ideological point of view of, conservation movements, right? I mean, and I use in many ways the U.S. example because you can sometimes think that the U.S. has a particularly strong commitment to this kind of religious, almost religious faith in private property. However, it also exists, I think, at the messy level, where the organizational and institutional level, and I think this is something that was kind of brought out in that everyday practices, and you see this very significantly in the ways in which, when this is actually played out, the question of property is much more embedded relationally and much less easily, I think, subsumed within this almost, again, mystical understanding of property as something that's, this God-given right. And this can be found in ways in which, on a very basic level, I mean, even now you need to have consultations in terms of the actual social value of a housing or development project, or more recently in terms of sustainability. In terms of this, sorry, I'm getting a bit ill. I think I'm catching it. My house is very socialist when it comes to sickness. We share everything apparently. But also in terms of the ways in which at an institutional level, there's all sorts of different alternative arrangements. And these can go from more obvious anarchist collectives and configurations that have been created to types of cooperatives, housings, models. And then I think on the individual level, there's kind of very deep ways in which we can think about things like public parks, for instance, or think about the ways in which we have shared spaces. So in this way, what you begin to see is the fact that within just the hegemony private property of property, already the field of meaning allows for a whole range of different ways for it to be ideologically, organizationally, and individually embedded, and in a certain sense, hegemonically dealt with its potential tensions and even contradictions. So what this then allows for, I think, is, and this is what I'm quite interested in as well, is different spaces for counter-hegemonic practices, right? So thinking about, okay, how do we use this type of kind of realities, right, property. To think about different ways in which it could be embedded, different ways in which it could be arranged. And what this allows for as a beginning point is to move for an either or. And then again, start thinking about this in terms of different resilient forms of embedded configurations. So this is where I think resilient property theory and post-Marxist theories by Laclau and Move are so incredibly helpful, at least for me in terms of this. So does someone want to come in with this one?
Mark's next.
So
Yeah,
go ahead. Mark.
yeah, thank you, Peter. So.
Oh,
I wanna-
sorry about that.
Oh, no, perfect. So I want to give a little background on how we came about squatting in the state, and then also where resilient property theory has come out in some of our writings. If you see the QR code there, that'll take you to a Zotero page that has a bibliography of recent writings around resilient property theory by the three of us, but also by a few others that have been working in the field. So when we started working, and I'd say the first thing to start off as we think about resilient property theory is that as much work as we put into the book and squatting in the state, squatting in the state was not a complete expression of what we were doing. And it's been something that's evolved over the years as we've engaged other scholars, as we've engaged our network of interested people in this area. That have helped us think and really refine and rethink about some of the commitments and the ways that we've expressed this theory. We started writing, and I should say, off the bat, that many thanks to the University of Essex, because the University of Essex is what funded our initial work on this project. So the University of Essex, through a collaboration grant, allowed me to come and spend 2 weeks working alongside Lorna in 2017. When we first began thinking about this project. And then eventually, when we started working on this project, we actually did not have in mind that we were writing a book or developing a theory. We had in mind that we were writing an essay, and that was probably going to be the end of it. But as Lorna said before, as we were delving into the problems that we were trying to think through and trying to solve, none of the tools that were on the property shelf were really adequate. They opened up new questions of inquiry, new things that we had to think about, new things that property itself was not specifically answering, or that property scholars were not answering in the field. When we started, and I still think that this is true, we were describing this as a project in realistic property. And there is an aspect of property realism in resilient property theory, particularly as we bring in elements like the state that are oftentimes hidden through liberal property theories. So that as we create, at least within the confines of property scholarship, where the state is not visible, is regularly hidden by traditional ways of thinking about how property and conflicts emerge. One of the things that I want to walk through a couple of the things that we have written that sort of help build out a greater body of the work that we have done. In the Journal of Semiotics, we wrote a piece titled "Property as an Asset of Resilience: Rethinking Ownership." And one of the things about that piece is it really takes specifically on the question of discourse, and the way that property discourse and the way we talk about property and the way that it is expressed through signals that are validated by property law shape the institution and create resilience within the institution. Lorna in a second is going to walk through the major steps that we take within resilient property theory. And then I will come back to talk about the way that resilience is articulated through our registers of scale. But one of the things that this article in particular, and I think is particularly relevant within the IDA framework, focuses on is the role that rhetorical tools play, whether those rhetorical tools emerge in signage, whether those rhetorical tools emerge in the way that we embrace or endorse different types of signals in property. And I'll give you just a short example from that article. One of the points that we make in that piece is those scale and size of different signage within different communities engaging in property. If you come to the US, if you enter into the US and you go into a neighborhood, you might see that neighborhood might have neighborhood watch signs or neighborhood community signs. And those signs are oftentimes cute and they're small and they're discreet and they match the general aesthetic of the neighborhood. And they're able to do that, right? Because they have the confidence and resilience of permanence that the law backs them, right? They're able to create this small signage that is able to communicate effectively to outsiders, to insiders, the community ethics that they are valuing in that space. You put that in contrast with squatting communities, right? That one of the first things squatting communities will oftentimes do is they will unfurl giant, colorful signs across the building, announcing their presence and now announcing where they're at. And the reason that they are giant, the reason they are colorful, is that they do not have that same resilience of permanence. They do not have the confidence to be able to rely on those aesthetics, right? So they have to make sure that their message is seen, their message is known, that they can communicate that message. And one of the things that we try to pull out in that article around semiotics and what signage and symbols do in the context of property is describe how owners and how the institution of property oftentimes in quiet and in invisible ways relies on that resilience as a way of communicating its power within communities and for individuals and by individuals. The second article I'll point out, and you're welcome to look through all of the Zotero library, and I think you can actually gain access to PDFs directly through that library. But the second article I point out is the article we wrote titled Real Property Transactions in the Network Society. And in that article, one of the things that we take on is develop is the tension that materialism and dematerialism play within the way property transactions are carried out. And this might be a little inside baseball if you're not in the property world, but inside baseball, it's a very American term. This may be very inside cricket for those of you who are not within the property world. But one of the things about property transactions is that they have become increasingly reliant on registry systems as a way of creating certainty, as a way of creating that confidence of that transaction. But even within those registry systems has been embedded this dematerializing of the experience of property. One of the things that we point out in Squatting to the State is we look across the 5 jurisdictions and we think about how squatting laws have shaped the way we think about the property system in different jurisdictions, is that the experience of possession has largely been downplayed by law, by criminalization of squatters on the land. And registry systems have played a major role in confirming the right of ownership that has kind of in a hub and spoke way ridden along with those criminalization laws. The importance of that, we believe, is that the dematerializing of property interests on the ground, either through the financialization of property, through the abstraction of property rights through paper title or through paper or through recorded title, rather than by possession, moves us further away from understanding how property actually operates in its material setting amongst communities and amongst individuals and within our shared lives. And drawing on the vulnerability theory side of reasoning from the body, starting from those material aspects, is a major cog of how we think property, how we should be thinking about property in the context of how we live it out. And I'll hand over to Lorna to.
And of course, when I studied land law in Ireland, we called it land law. I think most law schools in the US, in Europe, in the UK now will call it property law.
Mhm.
And there's even something that property scholars often don't specifically think about the way in which that dematerializes the resource and the asset that we're actually seeking to govern. And as Marc said, the cadaster and the register, which began as a tool of colonial power to draw up and create rights that were different from the material reality of how property was being used on the ground, has, through financialization and now through digitalization, has become more and more remote in terms of the systems of governance and the distance between those dematerialized transactional rights and what happens on the ground. So on the next slide, we do sometimes talk about whether what we're doing is a theory or whether it's a method. I'm interested in any thoughts that you have on that. I think it started out as a method, as Marc said, because the methods on the shelf that in our epistemic community didn't enable us to tackle the sorts of questions that we wanted to tackle. And if I go back to this idea around metaphysical truth claims and competing orthodoxy, one of the issues was that those were theories for state action. So the property scholar would choose their preferred, they would start from political philosophy and say, I'm an Aristotelian, or I'm a neo-Kantian, or they'd start from a philosophical commitment, and then they would seek to find evidence within case law to demonstrate that their philosophical commitment was what was driving the development of property law. And these competing orthodoxies were either arguing for state action or arguing for state constraint, depending on what political philosophy they started from. We were interested in a different question. Mm-hmm. And in part, even though obviously we have views and preferences, we tried methodologically to step back from that and to try and understand what is driving state action. And Marc said there are 5 jurisdictions that we focused on in the book: England, Ireland, Spain, the US, and South Africa. And in each of those jurisdictions, we were trying to actually trace what is it that leads states to towards tipping points, towards different decisions, in the way in which law emerges and is implemented to govern property. And in a way, I think what that meant was we became quite interested in that as a theory of change, in trying to understand how does this whole system shift and change over time, and what are the levers that are operating here to be able to produce change. And it became for us, again, a lot of legal scholarship starts with the law, works through the law, and ends with the law. And we wanted to try and step back from that and locate the law within the property system. And that meant that it was very problem inquiry led in terms of how the project unfolded. We could see that there was more complexity in shaping the direction the law was taking than we could explain with liberal property theory. We drew on a number of different approaches to try and build a methodology. One was wicked problem theory, which was really helpful for us because, again, property scholarship and property law is very linear in problem solving. Identify the issues, identify the facts, identify the law, apply the law, and it narrows down the frame in order to simplify the problem. And we wanted to try and undo that and find structuring mechanisms to be better able to engage with the complexity. Again, if you were writing about squatting, you might write about it through a law and economics lens, or you might write about it through a homelessness lens, or you might write about it through a neighborhood and community impact lens. But we couldn't find any frames that were able to bring all of those things together. So for us, trying to work out how to keep in view the whole complexity of the problem was important. I've mentioned vulnerability and the way in which we drew on vulnerability and its emphasis on institutions as allocators of resilience, because that's what we see the state doing through the property system. It's allocating resilience to some stakeholders at the cost of others, and we wanted to unpack that. Marc, I think we'll talk a little bit about scale and the way we used scale theory, but finally, in terms of how we were trying to map out the whole of the problem, we drew on some applications of actor network theory and to try and move away from a binary idea about the parties, a binary transactional idea, but instead to try and look at this problem through the lens of the individuals who are affected by it, the squatters, the owners, the neighbours, by the collective interests that were being brought to bear and putting pressure on the state, whether that's social movements on the one hand or market actors on the other, and also the way in which different institutions are bringing pressures on a state to provoke action and response to property problems. So it became a methodology for trying to talk through and analyze that whole picture. And significantly for us, of course, unlike liberal property theories, to bring the state back into view and focus on their responses. Marc.
So as we, Peter, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay. So one of the things that we talk about in our process is pulling all of these things together in some way of speaking to property law and speaking to property, but also where property speaks to those things. So we oftentimes talk about the whole topography of the space, the looking for the hidden hinterlands, those stories that underlie and norms that underlie the values that underlie the way we think about problems.
Sorry, ladies, you just got lady
And looking at the interconnectedness of relationships and individuals with communities. And this gets into the actor network theory of thinking about how property and property relationships is oftentimes within nodes. Again, think about your neighborhood, right? You could think about your own home as just a single unit, a single parcel in that space. You could also think about it as connected to your neighbor directly by its physical location. You could also think about it as connected to the community of members who are participant in those spaces, right? And so there are all of these different ways of relations that are formed both physically and relationally across different actors. We try to take seriously the stakeholders of the project, and so taking into account seriously not just individuals but the state specifically. So understanding and bringing the state back into place. So we go to the next slide. And so getting to scale theory and how scale theory relates to this problem. When we thought about property, we thought about the resilience that property confers. You know, we thought about this on three different types of registers that emerge. The rhetorical register, the jurisdictional register, and the material register. I'm just going to take just maybe 2 minutes to explain each of these. The rhetorical register is really about how these high abstract ideals get channeled as a resilience for property. I believe Bram mentioned earlier the pre-state commitments that may be found in natural theory or natural law as a way of justifying property, that your property doesn't emerge from the state, it emerges because you have some natural relationship to God or to some natural inherent right that you have to own something or to own property, and that the state should really be outside of that equation. But that is a source of resilience, right? That is a source that people can look to inherently, that abstraction, to justify or to validate their claims to property. But they're not just on that end, right? We could also look at things like human rights to housing, which are things that start in the abstract, that start in the natural, above the state kind of mode that attempt to influence or shape the way we think about how property should be deployed or used. We have the jurisdictional registry, or what we sometimes call the hierarchical registry, right? So how do we order relationships? And property, for all of its faults, does a really good job of ordering relationships, right? We know that owners oftentimes have way more rights. Some scholars will call the owner the agenda setter for how they think about property, right? That the law flows through the owner's ability to navigate and to stipulate how their property is used, or whether they will allow for other uses or people to come onto their property. In England, we have a system of estates that is, again, another system of ordering property according to time and according to how parties might participate in time or based on conditions or different changes in those conditions, right? But those are essentially backed by that legal hierarchical relationship that the state confers and on what creates within the context of individual owners or other types of users in property. And then finally, we have the material registry, which are more the physical things, right? How big is your land? How much is your land worth, or the value of your land? Where is it located? Is a rural piece of property that's 40 acres worth the same amount as an urban piece of property in Manhattan that's a quarter of that size, right? And so those material questions provide these sources of resilience as well as parties begin to accumulate these rights. What is interesting in squatting in the state in resilient property theory is that these registries are not isolated. They are oftentimes combined, they are hybrid, and they will oftentimes be utilized in conjunction with one another. For example, South Africa has adopted human right to housing in Article 26 of the Constitution. That is a hierarchical expression of a rhetorical right that's created that hybridity in that space. The last thing I'll say, sometimes those registries are used to block each other or distort the way those registries are played out, right? Particularly on the rhetorical lens, where a rhetorical claim to a natural right to housing might be used to say to the state, no, you don't get to regulate my property in that way because my interest is pre-state interest, right? And so I'll stop there and I'll hand back over to Bram.
Yeah, colleagues, I will be very short because I think we've been talking for a long time and we are much more interested in engaging with you than spreading our views. And so what we have recently tried is then to see if we can apply all this to a more concrete situation. And so we've been looking, for example, at climate litigation cases, and in particular, the most recent climate litigation case in front of the European Court of Human Rights, where the Swiss senior citizens tried to argue in front of the Court of Human Rights or complained, that the Swiss government was not doing enough. And that is not a case that concerns property per se, because they are invoking the right to life and the right to private life or human dignity in a way. But what we've done, and we wrote about that too, is see if we can use this lens of resilient property theory and apply that to that situation and what that teaches us, and whether or not the property actually can play or maybe should play a role in addressing these pressing issues such as climate litigation. And then all these things that we have been talking about resurface. So we then this orthodoxy of dematerialized property makes no sense anymore all of a sudden, because it's about my land and the way in which I use my land that does contribute to, I don't know, making emissions, or I'm not taking enough measures to protect my land against drought or flooding or fire or anything else. And you see that in these cases, and that challenges private law per se, in particular, and property law, therefore as well, that it's not only about the here and now anymore, but in these cases, questions of multi-generations and future generations come across the corner. And we need to figure out, how do we factor that into our system? And it turns out, well, not it turns out, I think we are able to translate that back into our thinking, because that resilient property framework analysis, if you call it like the method or theory, allows for us to do that, and allows for us, and here we come back to time again that Marc was talking about, it allows us also to see property not only in a single moment, but rather in a on a longitudinal scale of time, and it brings in the state. And I think that's the most important bit. Peter, would you mind doing 2 slides? That's the paper we wrote, but one, yes. And so that teaches us, I think, quite a lot of important things, and that is where we are at the moment, I think, and also how we come to you, to learn, for input, for conversation, is that this idea, that approach that currently rules the way in which lawyers look at property law, and maybe also other disciplines, is this idea of this liberal construct of the private realm, that depoliticizes property law. It takes property law outside of the democratic process, out of the discussion. In fact, property is weaponized in a way to say, stay away with your political process and stay away with all your futuristic thinking or climate change or anything. I am the lord of my manor. I am the owner of this piece of land, and therefore, I decide what happens. And the state in particular should stay away. There's more to say on that, but maybe for the discussion. And so, by reframing property theory and property law, that allows us to widen the lens, and it allows us to widen the lens to see more what's going on, and then to try to map, identify the resilience needs of all the stakeholders involved, not only that private property holder, and maybe not only also the state, but everyone involved in that picture, current and future, and allows us to see this in a different light. And so that allows us to shift away from this thinking and this orthodoxy of private property as being its own thing, and placing property law, where I started today, into the democratic process. And to accept maybe that in a democratic process, at least that's how we understand democracy theory here, is that in democracy approaches, outcomes are temporary and they're open to negotiations. And it's very weird that property is not. And it's the thinking, and I think that's again where we are, the thinking about how do we combine this idea, and if we bring property within the realm of those democratic processes, what does that mean? And how do we move forward from that? Let me leave it at that, and give it to Peter for the final thing.
Thank you. No, I'll also be very quick then, because I know that we want to open up for the next hour for questions, or as long as we have. So for me, everything that's been said, I mean, I share, and I think this critically opens up for a kind of more refined and I would say expanded view of counter-hegemony, one that I would say needs to go beyond resistance. And this is part of a broader project that I have worked on over the last couple of decades, that I wrote one of my first books about. That's not very arrogant, pretentious, sorry, that I wrote a book about a long time ago, that was looking at the ways in which traditional notions, particularly within the Marxian tradition, still held on to, I think, quite modernist, and quite ironically hegemonic ideas of change as linked to questions of resistance that was very much rooted in a tradition of sovereignty, counter-sovereignty. So what I like about here is this allows us to begin the process, or to undergo the process, of redefining counter-hegemony. And if we see a traditional view as resistance framed as opposition to dominant orders, and a focus on rupture and antagonism, what we can see with the RPT IDA synthesis, sounds very cybernetic, sort of like a sci-fi show, allows us to move beyond resistance to the construction of durable alternatives. And it emphasizes the material and institutional resilience of counter-hegemonic practices. And this is something that I think is because just as in many ways property law has attempted to dematerialize property, I think what RPT and IDA can do is not just rematerialize property in terms of bringing it back into its actual material space, as Lorna said in a previous point about, like, for instance, retaking land, retaking the importance of land, right? But also in terms of really taking seriously the different ways in which it can be materialized, right? So it's not just about material, it's about this process of materialization and the different forms of institutional and social embeddedness that allow for different ways in which this materialization can both emerge and become resilient and durable. And this allows us then to think about building alternatives inside and outside law and the state. So we can think about mechanisms of not just resistance, but resilience, and the materialization of alternatives. So embedding counter-hegemonic discourses into institutional and legal frameworks. And I think we're already seeing this in something that we're doing, for instance, in parts of cover, but thinking about the ways in which the crisis of austerity allows for post-capitalist alternatives, but often within the ways in which very particular types of local authorities, for instance, talk about things like the need for mutual aid, right? So this allows us to begin thinking about leveraging property regimes, such as like land trust, for instance, in order to create more sustainable alternatives and ones that are both local but also scalable. And this also provides a kind of idea of thinking more radically about durability through institutionalization. And there's already a long history of things like housing trust and cooperative ownerships. But what I would be interested here in looking at building multi-scale or governance systems to mediate these conflicting interests. And what becomes very interesting and important here again is that if we understand that hegemony exists in terms of not just in a way getting rid of alternatives, but incorporating them, we begin then to see the ways in which an alternative type of property regime, which I am interested in, because as we talked about a resilient property theory, I think, whatever the normative commitments of Lorna, Bram, and Marc may be, right, serves as, I think, a very strong epistemological, methodological framework. In this case, if you're talking about things like counter-hegemony, right, some of the things that I am interested in, why I'm part of cover, is thinking about how you create multi-scalar systems to mediate conflicting instances, and how then things like private property can not just be eliminated, but maybe reinscripted and reincorporated into more global forms of commons-based property regimes. And this then involves things like practical tools for adapting legal systems to accommodate these types of plural property arrangements, and thinking about them not just in terms of pluralism, but thinking about them in terms of processes of organization and reorganization for rematerializing and making resilient alternatives. So again, just some key insights. So we can see resilience as transformation. So counter-hegemonic progress are not just reactive, but can be proactive and create enduring systems of governance and social relations. We can also think about the ways in which this helps to challenge neoliberal norms. And these can be alternative frameworks to resist privatization, financialization, and dematerialization, and other exclusionary practices. And it can shift focus to collective resilience and rematerialization, especially around things like land and more inclusive property institutions. And I think for me, I would like to really look at different forms in which commons ownerships can be made resilient. And especially in the face of different types of legal and market pressures, but also the ways in which when we look at the commons, then not as just a form of property regime, but as a type of resilient set of dynamic relations that are embedded in institutions and subject relations, what are the kinds of democratic spaces and allowances that can emerge from this? And how does this provide a different way of thinking about alternatives in terms of resilience as opposed to resistance? So again, I think what would be very interesting here is that RPT and IDA integration offers a transformative lens to challenge entrenched ideologies of private property, opening pathways for resilient, democratic, and inclusive systems of ownership. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming. And we're obviously very open for questions. And just to show things, this picture is actually something that I found, and it's only 2 blocks from my house, and it was the first eco housing and one of the first anarchist commons property, ecological commons property in the UK. And like I said, it's, sometimes the revolution is in your backyard and you don't even know it. So this was 2 blocks from where I currently live. So thank you everyone very much. I will stop sharing now, and I appreciate everyone's coming.
Thank you. What do you think?
A question from.
I have reflections rather than questions.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about the subject to make any.
That's fine, neither do we, so that's it.
I genuinely thought this was a methodological approach because discourse analysis as a research method is fairly well written about and studied. So it's very interesting to see where the research is going. Perhaps there's a research method which can be developed, which will kind of speak more to not only to property law people, but also generally to other forms of analysis and discourses. So that's been something new that I've learned. I really appreciated how the point about how property law shapes power and hegemony rather than because the counter that power shapes laws or property laws is it's a fairly obvious point, not to say that there's no need
research on it, but like property law shaping power and hegemony is quite interesting. But I also wanted to kind of perhaps share my own initial reflections about how violence could be used as a framework. And I know vulnerability has been used and kind of touch upon it. You did touch upon it in your presentation, but I was also wondering that one of the other perhaps more theoretical frameworks could be about violence, especially state violence. And I say that because, like for example, at least in India, where there's a massive slum dwelling population, Asia's biggest slums are in India. Many people have occupied lands and they have built houses. They live there for generations. Even when the state offers alternative housing, they choose to live there. So there's perhaps a sense of community. Now, with rising population, GDP, there is a need for development. Now, this development, whatever it means, could only happen at the cost of violence or against a certain population. So there is, and then it's also interesting because when state machinery comes into the picture, people do just stand around and watch the demolition. So a specific like J.C. Bamford, which is a very famous English company, makes excavators. Its Twitter page was completely kind of overflowing with videos by Indians watching other Indians' houses getting demolished because they really appreciate how the excavator works. And it all made me think about that, like how people like recording, like watching, and how state violence happens, and we participate in it, and how property is at the center of it often. So therefore, it kind of perhaps there's a sense of violence associated framework that could be used, but also and I also think that it is not like one of the things that is that people on these, at least maybe I'm too, because I know the jurisdictions you're focused on primarily from the first world. So perhaps the conceptions of property in the third world are very different, where the boundaries of property is not defined by personal rights. Rather, it's defined. There's origins are not even in God; it's just in the commons.
Yeah.
So, which kind of provides an alternative thesis to what you're saying about, and that might or might not make sense given resilient property theory, but I think that it was interesting because if property is, I don't think it necessarily goes back to God, but it might go back to, so how far does it go? It goes back to some kind of communal ownership which was already there, which also is evidenced in multi-generational housing, which is absent in first world countries. Therefore, there is a certain sense of distinction. Therefore, perhaps, and this is not to say that your work is Eurocentric, but perhaps your work covers a fairly, maybe a more recent phenomena rather than an ancient historical phenomenon. And also, I completely appreciate that we're three people writing about a few things and can't write about the whole world. But perhaps like an alternative to God could be existing property rights in the commons in certain parts of the world, because that's how people have lived. And there has been cases as well from the Supreme Court of India, Olga Tellis, which is a very famous case about the right of slum dwellers to reside where they are, and which has actually stopped state development. The case was 85. However, since 85, things have changed in the past 40 years, and therefore there has been a bit more of a conversation on how development is needed. So the squatters don't have a constitutional right to squat. So the Supreme Court has said that already. Therefore, the conceptions of my other point was maybe conceptions of property are more closely linked to development. And so there's a framework of violence, and then that violence connects to RPT and the IDA, this kind of analysis, and that also is perhaps tangentially linked to what we understand by development, especially in the developing part of the world where there is more development needed, therefore lesser need of communal property and not necessarily individualistic property rights. But that's just an alternative thesis to think about.
So could I ask a question? And I think I know what the answer is going to be, but I'm not sure. I'm very interested in this, in violence. Is there a tradition in political science of violence as a discourse? Because there is a tradition in law of law as violence. And in fact, one of the scholars that we cite, particularly around Nomos, Robert Cover, wrote a very nice piece titled
Violence in the Word.
Violence in the Word, dealing with this, that the basic underlying driving factor of law is violence, state-sanctioned violence against individuals. So I'm just kind of curious if because that would be a very interesting connection if there is this political discourse or violence as a discourse in political theory in connecting to that concept.
I am not a political scientist. I'm a lecturer at the law school, so and I teach contract law. I'm just interested in this thing. So I just swaddled into this class in this lecture. Sorry. I think there is something to do with also some I do have some questions about social contract, the breaking of social contract within communities that has allowed perhaps capital to flow into property. And of course, violence is only a means, but the consequences of it. So if the motive is, I could say that the motive is development, the means are, if the means could be violence, but then there is a breakdown of what property in itself means as within the context of the social contract of the community. So if we were to say that the state, I remember, I do think you mentioned that the state still regulates a lot of property laws, tells how exactly certain properties have to be managed, HMOs, for instance, in the UK, how many occupancies there can be, there cannot be, sole regulated, what's the size of certain rooms, it has to be ventilated, there have to be signs and so forth. So there is a state, but there is also this sense of breakdown of social contract of how citizens interact with the state about property rights. And that breakdown is also connected to what. So I think my reflection is partially on like violence and as a framework to define how property law shapes our narratives about power. So there is something there, but I don't know. I haven't read the book. Perhaps I'll read and write back to you. And read your work. I noticed there's a book chapter as well with Lorna and I think Marc. So probably I'll read that, see if I'm interested, and then I will.
Thank you, that's really useful. I see Conor has his hand up, but I just wanted very quickly to come back. I think it's a really fair challenge, and we absolutely, this is a journey of exploration for us.
Yeah.
And we're trying to keep a kind of contingent openness to the framework to try and understand where to go with it. And I think one observation is if I think about Daniel Patrick's work on law, property and disasters in the global south, where he's arguing that probably we need to look at property relations outside of the state, because in many of these settings the state doesn't have the capacity to be the arbiter of resilience, that things are simply happening on the ground, which is much more towards the material part rather than the hierarchical jurisdiction, and that's quite a different setting from we're both interested in the way in which Western ideas about property have been very resilient. And I think particularly in these contexts, the question around what's the, rather than starting from assumptions about the role of the state, our question is always, how are states responding? It's not a theory for state action, it's a theory of state action, to try and in different case studies in different settings understand what are the capacities that a state has, how does it react to property problems, and what does that tell us about the different pressures that state actors and institutions also experience in these different types of property setting. But Colin, can I jump to you?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lorna, and good to see you at the distance. Marc, Bram, and Lorna, I always learn a lot from you guys, listening to you guys. I think it's very interesting, this connection of resilient property theory with hegemony. And while you guys, with Peter, you were going through it, there were at least three areas in which or three keywords in which I think there is a strong connection between hegemony and resilient property that, apart from this last response from you, Lorna, I haven't really heard that much about. So let me just say what the three are and see what you may have to say about it. And the three were the language that we use. The second one was the geography, and the third one is voices. So the language, by that I mean really the fact that we're talking in English, and the disproportionate attention that we pay when we talk about property in comparative analysis, the disproportionate attention that we pay to those jurisdictions that work in English language. Obviously, the US, which is, hegemonic in all senses, and also in relation to this. I know this is a feature of all exercises of comparative analysis, so this is not unique to property. It's a feature of all exercises of comparative analysis that we pay disproportionate attention to those jurisdictions that writes in English. But being aware of it, I think, will require us interrogate a little bit more, what we may be missing from the concept of property and the polysemy of the idea of property by looking disproportionately at those jurisdictions that work in English language, which is so hegemonic. The second one is the issue of geography, and is connected to this. Again, the disproportionate attention that we pay to the US, but also to English law and to jurisdictions in the global north, and the very little attention that we pay to countries in the global south about how they define and interpret and regulate property, other than South Africa, maybe a little bit of India. By and large, the other countries in the global south get really very little attention. It is my understanding, or it is my interpretation of the field. And again, this is not unique of property theory at all, or property law. But I think it's something that, if we want to challenge hegemony, I think it seems important to question these observations. And the third one, other than language and geography, the third one is the voices. And this is where my approach from international human rights law comes in handy, because as you guys may know, there are three main subsystems of international human rights law. There is one in Europe, there is one in the Americas, and there is one in Africa. All three of them have a definition of property rights, but we pay a disproportionate attention to the definition of property in the European system. And we don't look sufficiently at how it is defined in the Americas and in Africa, which is substantially different. One could say that the reason why we look at Europe is because it is more sophisticated, it has been around for longer, there are simply many more cases. But perhaps the reason why there are so many cases and has been so influential is because it tends to be very maximalist. In the Americas and in Africa, they tend to be more nuanced in the idea of property, to the extent to which they're going to protect individual property rights. They are also more communal. They are also more concerned about the social dimension of property, much more than in Europe. So maybe the reason why we pay more attention to Europe is not that it has been around for so long, but rather it has been around for so long because it is so maximalist that it is beneficial for people who have power and the ability to go to courts. So it seems to me that if we're going to challenge hegemony, it's important to interrogate these questions of the language in which we are talking, the voices that we are paying attention to, and the countries in general that we are investigating. Thank you.
No, could I come in on that? Is that all right?
Sure.
Because no, I agree with that, Caldo, and that was something that I don't come from this field, that I think is extremely important, because obviously IDA doesn't come from that things, and those aspects are really important, and I think so. Then when we look at this from a kind of a hegemonic viewpoint, right? I think the language is extremely important, and one of the things that I think an IDA perspective, but certainly the kind of work that a lot of us do, is actually not just, if you will, decolonizing what may be kinds of how we study and how we think about property regimes, right? But looking at the different nuances that can exist there, because there's a huge amount of casework that research that is being done now in terms of thinking about the commons, but also thinking about broader questions that are not actually centered in Europe or the European tradition, right? So I think that's a really important point. And I think the geographic point there is important in terms of this process of rematerialization and thinking about very fundamentally how this is being rematerialized, where and from what perspective. And I think also thinking about this in terms of the different ways that property is being understood in relation to each other. So from a point of view, I think, of critical political economy, this is incredibly important because what you're seeing now, for instance, that becomes so critical is how quickly, right, property, when it's connected within supply chains, for instance, right, is allowed to become more malleable. And in certain places, it's more protected. In certain places, it's less protected. And the different ways this is mobilized for that purpose, right? So I think that that's really important. I also think that the voices part that you brought up, and you know, I mean, one of the key aspects of this is also really looking at the ways in which not just that there might be different traditions and what is getting more of a focus, but looking at the ways in which they actually engage and teach each other. So I'll give you a very clear example, right? One of the more interesting questions that I don't know if it's been studied within the legal thing, but it's certainly something that I've been looking at and interested in, is that in Chile, for instance, right, in the first really strong instantiation of neoliberalism as an ideological project, one of the first things Pinochet did not do was completely privatize the natural resources. And why didn't he do that? Because fundamentally, he wanted to give the right to the Chilean state to police dissent, right? And why is that important? Because that was literally used as a framework by the United States and then Europe when it wanted to create mixed property regimes within development processes 10 years later, right? For being able to increase the militarization of the civic policing units, both at the federal and state level, for essentially creating mass incarceration regimes. So when we study these things, it's not just, for me, it's not just to say, okay, which property rights regimes are, you know, interesting, and how do we make sure, but it's also to see the ways in which they are historically critically connected. And they are connected in processes of hegemony and counter-hegemony, right? So I think the points that you're bringing out, certainly, I mean, I don't want to speak for the property law discipline because I'm not part of it, but certainly I think one of the amazing things about critical theory and ideology and discourse analysis and the work that we're doing in Cover is that all of those aspects are really incorporated, right? Because it's fundamental to what we're studying, how we want to study it, in the critical project that we're engaged with. So I really appreciate that.
Can I just add, Calder? Thanks for these observations. It's really both of these points. I feel so encouraged actually to look outside of also the European systems. I can't resist, Calder, to say that I of course also work in Dutch, French, and German. But that's not an answer to this point, I think, at all, because that's just more of the same rather than, you know, looking for the different. And I just wanted to highlight here that we are talking about this actually a lot. But we're also very sensitive. There is a colonial aspect to this, that there has been a time where, of course, especially European legal systems have exported their property law to other parts of the world, and then made possible in other parts of the world things that were unthinkable in Europe. You know, the ownership of other people, I think, in the as slavery as one of the prime examples. And so the responsibility, and I think this is very important for us, but the responsibility to look back, you know, and to take inspiration maybe from indigenous, and this is one of Marc's specializations, from indigenous communities, or from, you know, oral history, from you know, completely different people who completely differently organize themselves. And Marc and I yesterday were just talking about time, the concept of time. And there are communities, local communities, that are unable doesn't sound the word. They have a different conception of time. And so when they are confronted with, let's say, Western thinking, then you get this very interesting conflict on property, because they don't see property in the here and now only, but connected to the past and therefore also to the future. And they have this circular idea. And it's very difficult for us to you know, to place that in our Western trained way of thinking. and therefore all the more important. That's really so. I mean to say we shouldn't ignore it, but all the more important. Sorry, Marc, go ahead.
I'm gonna say and I don't know if this is a confirmation or an indictment of us, or maybe a little bit of both. But you know, when we first started writing Squatting in the State, the jurisdiction that had our largest attention was Argentina.
Yeah.
And I would say that at least 2 of the 3 reasons that you list were reasons that we felt like we were out over our skis with Argentina. We were not familiar with the geography. We'd never been there. We'd never been on the ground, unlike the other jurisdictions that we had dealt with. And there was unique language and there were unique cultures that were in place. And we did bring Argentina back in the conversation in the pandemic in the last chapter, but it was a very slight. And so I think one of the things we have been very sensitive of thinking the need to bring in and try to incorporate scholars that can help us understand other traditions and expand in those directions.
And just one other thing I want to throw on the table on that is we've been recently trying to think about this also through the lens of the international community. And I'm thinking about examples in terms of how property shows up in constitutions. One example is that Ireland had a socialist revolution in 1916, and its 1937 constitution protects the right to private property. It didn't get there in one go because the first post-revolution constitution in 1922, the draft constitution included a property clause based on the constitution of the USSR at the time. But in the treaty negotiations, the UK refused to sign the Treaty of Independence unless that clause was removed from the draft Irish constitution. So there was this kind of external influence. First, actually, in what Ireland came up with in its constitution, it was very outward looking and looking to the world for other examples of constitutional frameworks. But the UK blocked that to avoid the risk of having a socialist state next door. And also, we're interested in the work we've done in South Africa on the journey that from the ANC and their approach to the new constitution and the way in which the international community affected the way in which that the process through which that constitution came into being and affected the content. Again, because there was a kind of powerful international community influence in favor of liberal and neoliberal concepts of property. So we're kind of interested, and it goes back to the question around what does the future look like? When we look backwards, we see the dominance of Western jurisprudence. And one of the things we're interested in is if we think there still is an international legal community, what are the ideas that we think the next 50 years are going to be embedding in our thinking? If we think that the 19th century was Europe's century and the 20th century was America's, we're trying to think about what the role of the international community is into the future. Ting and Camilla, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, is it me?
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Lorna, Bram, Marc, and Peter for your presentations. So my question is also about jurisdictions. But I think you have already answered part of it. But I think my question is more specific about the nature of the system that you are studying. So it seems that you focus on democratic systems. So I'm just wondering. Because if in undemocratic system, the state always plays a key role in shaping property relations, but in a very different way in the democratic system. So so to what extent that you think studying undemocratic system would help you develop resilient property theory? And you mentioned the resilience needs of the state. And do you think the resilience needs of state in democratic system and undemocratic system, would they share some kind of common resilience needs, or they're quite different? Thank you.
Could I maybe have a short answer on this, and then I think there's some if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
So no, I think that that's a very good question, and the reason I'm coming in is that, I mean, I did my initial work, which wasn't in legal theory, actually on China and marketization and the process of authoritarian capitalism, which I have then, for better or worse, written quite extensively about afterwards. So I think this question of how we define what is authoritarian in democracy becomes incredibly important. And also looking at the ways in which there are authoritarian states and democratic states, and they might be either differences in degree or kind. It may also have different similarities and differences in the ways in which they respond to the needs of capital. So I think in this respect, sometimes what you can see, certainly within property law, is a lot of very large similarities between authoritarian and democratic states in this respect. I think sometimes what you can see, though, is also much more differences. This can be very much in terms of formal differences, in terms of the easier or more quick use of coercive practices to justify and retain private property law, which we've seen quite a bit of, or it often can be seen in quite protean ways in which it actually becomes, in certain senses, ironically, sometimes easier in which to subvert some of these laws, in the sense that when you have a situation like you do in many quote unquote democratic states, and I use that very for my own self things because I don't think any of us live in a democracy, to be very clear. What you have is that these are so entrenched within legal liberal legitimacy things that they're almost impossible to change. So in this respect, I mean, for sure, there are some situations in which in ostensibly authoritarian states, it's actually easier to create alternative frameworks than you would in certain places, such as the UK, right? So I think that's really important to look at, the richness of these discussions, but then also look at the ways in which different forms of resistances emerge, both in terms of being legally enshrined for that, and what is legally enshrined and what is not. And then also in terms of the different practices and cultures that exist in terms of that. So I think it's a good question, but I think that's exactly what RPT and IDA, when they're brought together, allows us to do, because it provides both an epistemological and methodological framework to critically look at these things from a level of the what ways in which these are, in a certain sense, embedding or not embedding, making resilient or not resilient, certain types of relational aspects around property.
Brilliant. And I'd say the headline for me is, as Marc said, we recognize the limits of our expertise in terms of the jurisdictions that we feel confident to talk about, but we're very, very open and very interested in collaborating and working with people who have expertise in other areas to help us to test some of the ideas. So we're very keen collaborators and would love to lean on expertise about other places to help us to go further. On democracy, one of the ways that, I mean, we're only recently, I think, trying to open up these questions about where property sits within a democratic system. When we were doing squatting in the state, one of the things that we kept trying to discipline ourselves away from was jumping to normatively driven answers to questions, and we kept trying to because we know in our discipline that basically draws us back into the models that we've had in the past, and it becomes quite hard to then imagine something that can be different from that. So we were trying to be a self-denying ordinance on normative content, but I think what we did allow ourselves as a very thin normative commitment was the idea, because often when we talk about these things, people say, why do we care about the state's resilience? I don't like the state any more than I like the market, and I don't trust the state any more than I trust the market. But we had this very thin very thin normative commitment that said it's better that democratic states don't fail. And that was one of the reasons why South Africa was a really interesting case study for us, because we were interested in the way in which the pressures produce a tipping point, and a state can tip from authoritarian into revolution and more democratic, let's say, than previously. So that's kind of as far as we got with that so far. Camilla?
Thank you. Thank you for a great presentation, and all the questions have been super good. So I have a few points. I want to kind of build on Koldo's points a little bit in terms of bringing discourse analysis to bear on the language of rights, and also kind of what do we mean by resilience, and what is its relation with counter-hegemony, because it seems to me that being resilient in the system, in a way, surviving, if you will, is very different than building a different logic that would replace the system, right? So really, what is the relationship with these two concepts? And in the same kind of critical manner, from this perspective of the discourse analysis, what do we mean by a property itself? Because you mentioned, Bram, the indigenous peoples. Yes, of course, they have a different relation with things, but many of them do not have the idea of property as we have it, because basically having something in a sense that I made it, I wear it, I have proximity with it, and everybody recognizes that it's mine, it doesn't mean that it's property. We have created an abstraction that is has other things attached to it. So basically, going into and I have written about this a little bit, and I can share the article on rights as property, but also property as a right. So even if we know if property exists in the sense that this abstraction that we can kind of separate ourselves from a thing and still own it in a way and claim it, that is different than to suggesting that that is a right, in the sense of the big thing of rights, right? So in a way, our constitutions have been built on the right to property, which is something that is sui generis to the Western world in a way, and has it, because there's from Hegel on, the separation of the property and of the thing and the being and how we understand each other. So this is something that I wrestle with, this kind of approach, because I wrestle myself in my own work. So it's not like a criticism of you. I would like to hear more if you have thought about this in this way. And following this, so if we question these categories, what do we mean as property as a counter-hegemonic narrative? Can we actually deploy that in a way? That would be super interesting, as Peter was super excited about. But basically, it is, how do we? I would like to hear more. And then I have a problem also with the idea of democracy, and I'm going to push it a little bit, because I understand that we all understand that there's no democracy today. However, we have property. And the logic of property is to entrench hierarchical relations. This is how it is, has been from the time immemorial. So there is a logic going on of this hierarchical logic, if you will. And we understand democracy in the kind of non-real way, let's put it like that, as a real understanding, as an actualization of horizontal, logics. But we don't have that. So how can we kind of, I think there's a little bit of confusion, or in how do we kind of connect this property and democracy in a way that is actually counter-hegemonic and that is actualizing more democracy than property, something that is today non-existent and something that is really existent, which is the property regime, right? And finally, just a very quick clarification. In one of the slides you had the relation with constituent power, but I didn't get what was that relation, because I don't know if I missed it or you didn't explain it, or it was just there in the slide. But I want, please talk a little bit more about the relation between resilience, counter-hegemony, and constituent power, because that is, I think, very interesting. Thank you.
So I just wanted to talk about the resilience part and maybe a little bit about the discourse and property part, and then because I think all those points, Camilla, I mean, these are not the first time we've talked about some of these things together. So I think what you're saying is extremely important. I think what is critical, though, here is that we can trace out the ways in which notions of resilience or similar type of synonyms around sustainability or around protection and defense, right, of revolutionary projects was largely abandoned pretty much after the Third International in a certain sense, right? And I bring that up very particularly as a historical juncture because I think what has come to happen is that resilience itself has become just as a term and then as a type of signifier has been largely co-opted as something about being resilient within the system, and within a neoliberal way becoming individually resilient. But I think there's a very strong fundamental aspect here. I keep saying fundamental today. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I'm fundamentally not on point, but that is crucial here, which is about how do we make counter-hegemonic logics resilient? How do we defend them? How do we make them durable? And how do we shift from the ways in which hegemony expects itself and expects us to be inscripted in making it hegemonic or it resilient, to actually making alternatives resilient? And I think that this type of critical project is absolutely crucial to any counter-hegemony. And I think actually the difference between resistance and counter-hegemony, what makes something actually counter-hegemonic, is that you're not just having a different logic or a different antagonism, but you're actually creating the forms of praxis necessary to sustain it. And I think you've used different languages, obviously, but I think some of the work that you have actually talked about in terms of the extreme importance of protecting plebeian democracies and protecting the question of plebeian power in this sense, Camilla, for me, is very much about like, how do you make these alternatives resilient? What is our responsibility to protect these things? Now, obviously, I'm speaking from my own perspective in this critical aspect, but I think that was one thing that I thought was very interesting about resilient property theory for kind of this project, because it takes very, very seriously, particularly in a time in which we're just coming out of capitalist realism, really, and saying, this isn't the end of history, right? So if we're going to make alternative histories, we have to do more than just be resistant. We have to actually make these revolutionary things resilient. And I think it's absolutely also important to note that it's a very discourse of resiliency now that has been conscripted, right, into this hegemonic project. I think also, though, one of the things that you've taken things in terms of property, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to separate property, and this is something IDA allows us to do, from its historical function and what it does structurally, to the ways in which it can serve as a type of discourse for its actual reconfiguration, right? And I think, when people make claims like, this is mine, that actually opens the space, says, why? On what basis? For whom? For what reasons? What should be mine? What should be yours? How do we make these determinations? And it's that kind of intersection, that intervention, that if we can bring these frameworks to bear, we can turn property from something that's this kind of inherent structural feature into something that actually allows us to deconstruct the very dynamics and histories and underlying power relations that make property possible for different types of regimes. And I think you do see this in certain things in which, when I say you can use property as a kind of hegemonic discourse, not because I think we're using, property as things. I mean, this is just me speaking, but actually saying when you actually start things like, okay, who should own this piece of land, right? Or when you have movements that actually begin that process of asking these questions, or when you start bringing in within already existing regimes different forms of property relations, right? This actually serves as a point for doing exactly what you say, which is reconstructing, deconstructing, and ultimately transforming potentially this exact previous function of property. But that would be my view, obviously.
And one caveat, and one thing that I forgot to say about Chile, if I may.
Sorry, Camilla. I'm aware that there are people coming in here at 4 o'clock, so we need to wrap up. But I wanted not to. I'd love to talk to you some more about this. I wanted not to run away from your question about constituent power, because I put that on the slide. And it is to say that I realize that in some audiences, in some disciplinary contexts, the fact that you need to say that property is undemocratic and property is power seems a little bit obvious. However, one of the issues for us is trying to figure out how do we wire this back in to the conversations that we're having within a property law community, where those things are not obvious. And the constituent power point is about highlighting the exceptionality of the claims that property makes within a notionally democratic legal system. The idea that it places itself above, before, and in front of the idea of democracy. Laura Undercuffler, who's at Yale, writes a piece, and she's a person who is interested in progressive ideas about property. But she says that the idea that property promises permanence and the idea that it's temporary and contingent and subject to constituent power is one that within the property law community hasn't really been effectively asserted. And it's obvious to those outside, but partly why we need to do this work is because the property lawyers are the gatekeepers in some ways of the resilience of these ideas. And we're trying to figure out how to build the bridges to bring the things that you can help us with back into those conversations.
Can I make one minute
Really
of a
worried
point?
about class and starting in here at 4 o'clock.
I'll make this really quick. So I thought I heard, one of the things I thought I heard you say was about the role of rights and property rights and we know what these things are. I'm not sure that that's true. And I think that's one of the aspects of what we've expressed on dematerialization of property has done, that we might have the form, we might have the notional idea of what property is, but the reality is that we are regularly creating all of these new ways that things are filling in that form, and they're challenging the way we traditionally think. So.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for being here with us. Thank you, Peter. Hope you're feeling all right. We know that there's a lot that we're probably getting wrong here, and we're in a kind of stepping into a different space. So do send us any feedback, and we'd love to hear more from you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a really nice one, and thank you everyone.
Bye everyone. Thanks for attending.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.